March 7th, 1965. John Lewis strides alongside Hosea Williams of the Southern Christian Leadership Council in Selma, Alabama, leading hundreds of people across the then-named Edmund Pettus Bridge in a march for voting rights as citizens of the United States. At the time, in Selma state of Alabama, only 19% of blacks of voting age were registered to vote, compared to 69% of whites. This discrepancy was due, in part, by legislative provisions like poll taxes and literacy tests, and other tests or devices that proved to be obstacles put in the way of American citizens that were trying to exercise their right to vote. After walking across a bridge, John Lewis, Hosea Williams, and those who they led were met by representatives of the era's power structure, who deployed the tools at their disposal to thwart people who were trying to eliminate the friction between what they believed and how those thoughts and opinions were represented in government. There are a few reasons why I wanted to make this video. I think first and foremost, we need to evaluate how we administer elections, not in a way to sort of get our pitchforks out and try to see, where fraud occurred or anything like that. Quick clarification. When I say we shouldn't investigate election fraud, I mean we shouldn't be a hammer looking for a nail in trying to uncover election fraud that doesn't exist simply because you're upset that you lost an election. I just think there's signs that we've seen that indicate faith in our electoral system is starting to erode or has eroded. And that might be an understatement. That probably is an understatement when you think about January 6th. And something that's underrepresented in the discourse on how we want to administer elections is primaries, and the importance of primaries and how we choose representatives via primaries. There are a couple of different factors that lead me to this conclusion. So first is the number of competitive congressional districts has decreased drastically since the 1970s. So in the 1970s, according to the Bipartisan Policy Center's report, Governing in a Polarized America, a Bipartisan Blueprint to Strengthen Our Democracy, there are 101 competitive congressional districts. There were 101 competitive congressional districts in the 2012 election, compared to 152 from the 1970s. So that number has decreased by roughly a third. And so that's important when we think of primaries, because the only real election that matters in non-competitive districts is the primary election. And a vast majority of our congressional seats are elected in non-competitive elections. Meaning non-competitive in between Democrats and Republicans. The second trend that leads me to believe that primaries are important to focus on regarding election administration is the relative lack of turnout. The relative lack of turnout and the low voter turnout in primary elections. So in 2020, across the 42 states that held both Democratic and Republican primaries, the average participation rate across those states was 26.9%. And this is consistent with other rates of participation in primaries from previous cycles. So from 1980 to 2016, the percentage of votes cast in primaries as a share of eligible voters fluctuated between 14.5% and 30.4%. And the overriding narrative regarding why we see low voter turnout is due to voter apathy. And I just disagree with that. I think we're letting government off the hook by not expecting representatives of our government to encourage the highest level of healthy engagement with civic life as is possible. And one of the most fundamental ways that representatives can encourage healthy engagement is by eliminating the friction between people wanting to exercise their right to vote and them actually exercising that right to vote. And the low voter turnout in primaries indicates to me that there are certain obstacles put in the way, whether they're implicit or explicit obstacles, they're put in the way of voters who want to have their voice heard. And this has been a problem since the country was established. And will likely be a problem for many years and decades to come. But the current iteration of that problem, I think, lies in primaries. And in order to address it appropriately, constructively, I think it's important to learn lessons from our recent past and apply those lessons to how we navigate potential solutions. Which brings me back to the Voting Rights Act and trying to understand the context in which the Voting Rights Act was implemented, the provisions that the Voting Rights Act enacted, why they were effective, why they were ultimately deemed unconstitutional in 2013. All of these, I think, are useful in trying to come up with solutions to the problem of eliminating the friction between individual voters wanting to have their voice heard and that voice being listened to in government. So first, the Voting Rights Act, what it was and what it implemented. There's many different important concepts of the Voting Rights Act, but I wanted to focus on two. And this gets a little legalese, but bear with me because it is important information to know when we move into the discussion of primaries and election administration today. So those two concepts are the concept of preclearance and the concept of the coverage formula. So preclearance stated that for any jurisdiction, any town, any state that was deemed to have engaged in voting discrimination, that jurisdiction would need to get approval from the federal level to be able to implement any laws regarding election administration. So that was the concept of preclearance. And how a jurisdiction was deemed to have engaged in voter discrimination or not was covered by the coverage formula. And the coverage formula, at the time of its implementation, had two pieces. One, whether a jurisdiction used a test or device like a literacy test or a poll tax. And two, whether a jurisdiction had less than 50% turnout or registration rates in the 1964 presidential election. So a lot to unpack there. So first things first is that low turnout was an indicator of voting discrimination via the coverage formula. Two is preclearance was
incredibly it was an incredibly drastic measure, because it put precedence on the at the federal level instead of it put precedence at the federal level over the local and state governments. And this was the exact opposite of what was intended by the framers of our Constitution. So in Federalist Paper number 46, The Influence of the State and Federal Governments Compared, James Madison wrote that the first and most natural attachment of the people will be to the governments of their respective states. With the affairs of these, the people will be more familiarly and minutely conversant. With the members of these, will a greater proportion of the people have the ties of personal acquaintance and friendship, and of family and party attachments. And this makes sense if you think about it. You know, like, you might care more about the broken traffic light down the street than a genocide on the other side of the world. Like, not because you're, morally deficient or anything like that, but that broken traffic light has a higher probability of affecting your day-to-day life than perhaps than the genocide on the other side of the world. And so pre-clearance kind of flew in the face of this, because it again established federal precedence over the local and state governments. And so, in addition to sort of the benefits of decentralized government, Madison also observed that the federal government was the object of ire in the eyes of most individuals in the nation at the time he wrote the Federalist Paper number 46. So he wrote that the Federal Council was at no time the idol of popular favor, and that opposition to proposed enlargements of its powers and importance was the side usually taken by the men who wished to build their political consequence on the prepossessions of their fellow citizens. And he continues to write in that same paper, if an act of a particular state, though unfriendly to the national government, be generally popular in that state and should not too grossly violate the oaths of the state officers, it is executed immediately, and of course by means on the spot and depending on the state alone. So this last statement flies in the face of preclearance because federal authorities had power over the state for their affairs. However, the reason why preclearance was deemed to be constitutional was established in 1966 via the Supreme Court decision. It's either Katzenbach versus South Carolina or Katzenbach versus South Carolina. Anyways, it's so in that Supreme Court decision, it deemed the Voting Rights Act constitutional because of the insidious and pervasive evil which had been perpetuated in certain parts of our country through unremitting and ingenious defiance of the Constitution. So there were gigantic disparities between white and black voter registration rates in 1965 in certain states and certain jurisdictions. So in Alabama, Selma State, there was 69% of whites were registered to vote, while only 19% of blacks were registered to vote. And so this is the unremitting and ingenious defiance of the Constitution that was referenced in South Carolina versus Katzenbach. So it followed that remedies like the preclearance requirement were warranted, and in fact they were designed to shift the advantage of time and inertia from the perpetrators of the evil to its victims. So prior to the Voting Rights Act, any potentially unconstitutional legislation regarding election administration needed to be challenged individually, which was obviously a time-intensive and costly process. So the pre-clearance requirement shifted that advantage from individual voters that had felt that their rights were infringed upon to the jurisdictions and the legislatures of that were deemed to have been engaged in voting discrimination. By all accounts, the Voting Rights Act was a tremendous success. So 40 years after being implemented, many of those disparities in voter registration rates between whites and blacks were closed or altogether overturned. So in Alabama, in 2004, the gap was 0.9%. So 72.9% of blacks were registered to vote in Alabama in 2004, while 73.8% of whites were registered to vote. And similarly, in Georgia, Louisiana, Mississippi, South Carolina, Virginia, extreme discrepancies were closed during that time and due to the Voting Rights Act. However, the act was deemed unconstitutional in 2013, or the coverage formula was deemed unconstitutional in 2013 in a Supreme Court decision, Shelby versus Holder. And it's important to understand why. So the Voting Rights Act was originally set to expire 5 years after it was passed. However, it was reauthorized multiple times in 1970, 1975, 1982, and 2006. Crucially, though, the coverage formula was not updated since the 1970s. So in 2012, a year before Shelby versus Holder, there were jurisdictions that were subjected to preclearance based upon factors from 1972 or 1974, I believe. And so this was foreshadowed by the Supreme Court in 2009 in a Supreme Court decision, Northwest Austin versus Holder, when the court noted that the act imposed current burdens and must be justified by current needs. So basically, reading between the lines there is that jurisdictions were, again, subjected to preclearance based upon factors from the 1970s. And by 2012, I'll actually take a step back. It was very difficult to get out from underneath the preclearance requirement once it was imposed. So there were 12,000 covered jurisdictions between 1982 and 2009. Only 17 of those 12,000 were able to successfully bail out. It was known as the bailout provision, where they appealed to the courts that concluded that the given jurisdiction was not engaging in voting discrimination and therefore not subjected to preclearance. But that was rare. It happened only in 17 jurisdictions over a 27-year period of time. And furthermore, there were covered jurisdictions that had worse voting records than non-covered jurisdictions by the time Shelby versus Holder rolled around. So, for instance, Texas was a covered jurisdiction, and in 2012, in the general election, they had 49.6% turnout rate, so underneath that 50% threshold from the coverage formula. However, West Virginia had a worse voting record at 46.3% turnout in the 2012 November general election. However, West Virginia was not subjected to preclearance, and so there was an uneven application of which jurisdictions were subjected to preclearance. Also, side note, little fun fact trivia question for you. Which state has or had the highest turnout in the 2012 or 2020 general election? Minnesota. So congrats to Minnesota, Minnesotans. Go Skull. Yeah. So back to the Voting Rights Act. I'm not trying to undercut its importance or say that I disagree with what the act was out to accomplish. But it's important not to ignore the legal reasons why it was deemed unconstitutional. To be honest, I agree with those reasons. The coverage formula was based on factors that were 40 years old. There was uneven application of provisions of the act and unfair application of the provisions of the act. It put federal precedents over local and state governments, which went completely against the intentions of the framers of our Constitution. And rather than approach this discussion or these questions around the Voting Rights Act with a level of intellectual curiosity and a commitment to remove the obstacles that are put in front of American citizens who are trying to make their voice heard and exercise their right to vote, Nancy Pelosi took the stage in June 2020 on the 7th anniversary of Shelby versus Holder to share some of her thoughts around the Supreme Court decision.
In February 2013, many of us were gathered on the steps of the Supreme Court. That was the day of the oral arguments on this Supreme Court case, Shelby versus Holder. It was an honor to be with the Congressional Black Caucus as those arguments were taking place, the oral arguments. Following that gathering on the steps, we came back over to the Capitol to dedicate the statue of Rosa Parks, African-American woman in the capital of the United States, not only adding to the diversity of those statues, but upgrading the quality of acknowledgement there.
Notice that she focuses on a statue here as opposed to something more structural, which has a higher likelihood of affecting positive change.
Republicans showed up that day, spoke with all of us of how exciting it was to have Rosa Parks there. We thought perhaps this is an indication of shared values, but it hasn't been, but it wasn't. Thank you so much for your leadership in bringing us together to acknowledge the 7-year anniversary since that most unfortunate Supreme Court decision. You have given us a beautiful perspective just now of the history, some of the history. I want to add some to that. On March 7th, 2015, 2 years later, we all went to Selma for the 50th anniversary of the Voting Rights Act. Of the Selma March. President Barack Obama spoke. President George Bush spoke. It was our Republican colleagues were just pushing themselves to the front of the line to be with John Lewis and everybody else. We thought perhaps this was an indication that they would support the Voting Rights Act. Basically, they said to us, this is all you're getting, our presence here. Big deal. Shelby versus Holder. H.R. 4.
H.R. 4 is a bill to replace the coverage formula. It has passed the House as of August 2021, but has not passed Senate.
Section 4 to be fixed because of some misconception that the Supreme Court had. So when the court did what they did, they said, well, this, that, and the other thing.
This was that any formula to describe voter discrimination needed to be based on conditions present in the current day instead of decades prior. That was that the 10th Amendment reserves powers to the states that are not specifically granted to the federal government, including the power to regulate elections. The other thing was that the act violates a fundamental principle of equal sovereignty between state and federal governments, and actually prioritized the federal government over state and local governments, the exact opposite of what was intended by framers of our Constitution.
Here we are, 7 years since the passage of it, showing up at Rosa Parks, showing up at the 50th anniversary of Selma, saying all these things, but really dishonoring the spirit of it all. Because when we say to people who turn out, your vote is your voice, we have to remove every obstacle to participation, to that vote, to that voice.
The Bipartisan Policy Center's 2019 report, Governing in a Polarized America, a bipartisan blueprint to strengthen our democracy, lays out a variety of recommendations on reforms that we could adopt to our electoral system. In it, the authors note that primaries are low turnout affairs that are controlled by small key groups, whether those groups are party insiders, strongly ideological groups, or single issue blocs. Opening up party primaries to independents may be one step in increasing primary turnout, but it is easy to imagine that even with independents voting, there would still be a relatively low turnout environment with only the most motivated voters showing up at the polls and with small groups within the parties still playing outsized roles. According to the National Conference of State Legislatures, there are 6 different ways in which primary elections can be conducted. So-called closed primaries are primaries in which only registered party members are allowed to vote in a particular party's primary. So 10 states adopt or have adopted the closed primary system. On the other end of the spectrum, there are open primaries in which states don't register voters by party. Voters have a choice of which party primary to participate in which party primary to participate, and voters are only allowed to participate in one party's primary. Recently, there's been another type of primary election called jungle primaries. In this system, this was first adopted in California and has since been adopted in 2 other states over the past 10 years. In this type of primary, all voters, regardless of party affiliation, participate or use the same ballot. So candidates from different parties are listed on the same ballot, even in this primary system. And the top 2 or the top 4 candidates run off against one another in the general election. And the early returns on the top 2/jungle primary system are promising. The Bipartisan Policy Center's analysis of state election data noted that in the top 2 primary type, turnout was roughly 26%, considerably higher than any of the other types, the closed primaries or the open primaries and the various shades in between.
Because when we say to people who turn out, your vote is your voice, we have to remove every obstacle to participation, to that vote, to that voice.
When asked about her opinion on jungle primaries, this was Ms. Pelosi's response.
Another politics question. I wanted to ask you about California's primary, the jungle primary system.
Yeah.
Are you concerned that potentially could lock Democrats out of some key House districts where there are big pickup opportunities for Democrats. I'm thinking of
You
California.
guys want to talk politics. What is this? We're under the dome. We talk policy here. That in terms of a civics lesson, and not the politics so much, the California system, the jungle primary, is something that is called a reform. And I remember years ago, Senator Moynihan had said, if they call it a reform, it's not. And this is not a reform. It is terrible. It prolongs the process. It costs more money. It shuts out smaller parties and the rest. So I don't recommend this as a policy matter.
Ms. Pelosi's counterpart in the House of Representatives, House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy, a Republican, said, quote, "I hate the top two," when asked about his opinion on the jungle primaries. I don't want to be too conspiratorial about it or too conspiracy theory, centric about it, but it is suspicious that the leaders of the two main political parties are coming out against an innovation with how primaries are conducted, with how representatives are elected, when that innovation has shown some early signs of success. Especially when you take into context what we saw with Miss Pelosi's comment on Shelby versus Holder, where she withholds withholds the truth in order to forward some partisan agenda, and it kind of shows where her priorities lay in gaining power, retaining power, and any potential threat to that goal of hers. She's going to try to, she's going to try to strangle in the crib is the phrase that I'm thinking of, but that sounds dramatic. So she's going to try to suppress attempts to any threat to that power. And I don't want to make it seem like jungle primaries is the magic bullet. There's a couple weaknesses that have been shown in jungle primaries. It's two specific ones. So one is that if more candidates of a particular party are running in the primary than the other political party, they can cannibalize votes from one another and elevate candidates from the other party, even if it's the representation of a particular party isn't there. So what I mean by that is, if a district is 75% Democrat, 25% Republican, there's 5 Democrats running. There's 2 Republicans running, or maybe just 1 Republican running. The one Republican gets most or all of that 25%, and the 5 Democrats kind of cannibalize the 75%, and the Republican moves on to the general, even if that's not really representative of the district as a whole. So that's one weakness. Second weakness is that it bastardized incentives of the campaign process somewhat. So we saw this in California when the Democratic incumbent for Governor Gavin Newsom subtly highlighted pro-NRA credentials of a Republican challenger, John Cox, in a campaign ad.
Why is John Cox attacking Gavin Newsom for supporting common sense gun safety? John Cox stands with Donald Trump and the NRA. Cox called gun laws a waste of time, opposes background checks and a ban on assault weapons. And Gavin Newsom took on the gun lobby and won, and passed California's first comprehensive gun safety initiative. As governor, Newsom will stand with the students to put a stop to gun violence. Gavin Newsom, courage for a change.
And the thinking being is that he actually wanted to
gin up Republican support for Mr. Cox in order to be able to face off against him in the general election. So the incumbent was comfortably one of the top two. It was a matter of who the second candidate was going to be in the primary. So if it was a Republican in California, Mr. Newsom was much more likely to win that general election. Since California is such a blue state, than if he had to go against a Democratic challenger. So, those are two weaknesses, and when there's two candidates of the same party running in the general election, it actually causes voters to abstain from voting. So this came out in a study published in the California Journal of Politics and Policy, which found that 47.9% of so-called orphan voters, so voters of the party that is not orphan voters are voters who did not have a candidate from their party competing in the general election. And 47.9% of California voters abstained from voting in that case. So rather than having a moderating influence, it actually just caused voters of another party just to forget about voting. So in order to address those weaknesses, I think it might work to be able to do a top four with one guaranteed candidate from each of the two major political parties. So similar how Ohio State is always in the BCS because of whatever factors are included in that decision. Not to talk trash, Ohio's a swing state, so don't want to disrupt the great people of Ohio. But if that concept is applied to the general election in the top four, where one Republican and one Democrat candidate are guaranteed, and then two other sort of like wild card candidates, whoever gets the most votes apart from those candidates from each party, they move on to the general election. I think that would address some of the weaknesses of the jungle primaries that we've seen in its the first 10 years of its existence. And frankly, I don't know how, given the current situation, how there would be innovations to adopt such a system. Like, obviously Pelosi and McCarthy are not going to like an innovation that increases the likelihood that independent candidates are challenging Democrats and Republicans for particular seats. But the primary system, because of the trends we discussed, the increase in uncompetitive districts, low turnout rate, and another important trend is that more Americans are identifying as independent as opposed to member of the other two parties. So a Gallup poll recently showed that 44% of Americans consider themselves independents, compared to 30% Democrat, 25% Republican. So if primaries have this greater importance in who gets elected as representatives, primaries are tied to a party, one of the two parties, and neither of which can claim that they represent the views and opinions of a majority of Americans, or at least a plurality of Americans, then we have to think of ways to impact the electoral system in whatever way we can. And again, it's not a call for pitchforks, but I think being informed of these dynamics, being aware of these innovations,
is a necessity for them to be adopted. You know, this is, judging by Ms. Pelosi's response to Shelby versus Holder, you know, her comments in the 7th anniversary of Shelby versus Holder, I think she would prefer to keep Americans in the dark about the root causes of issues, about the underlying, about what is actually going on, as opposed to being a proponent of representation. So, you know, those words were measured, but she cares more about power than she does about doing the right thing for our country.